Every once in a while you come across a t-shirt that's something special. I have one with Marv's face on it, Marv from Home Alone. It's just a white t-shirt with his face covering up pretty much the whole thing. It's got the iron imprint on his forehead, and that's it. It's one of my favorites. And I just got this t-shirt. It's a Lego Han Solo. I don't know if you can read it, but it says, "I know." Instant classic. And it's gold. What's not to like? Anyway, today is video number 4 in a series I'm doing on this guitar. It is a Glarry GTL semi-hollow, and full disclosure, I got it for free from Glarry in exchange for a demo. If you're interested in seeing that, you can click on the eye in the upper part of the screen. Now, of course, it looked a lot different when I got it, but that is the whole purpose of this series, is to show you the modifications I made to it to make it more on par with, say, a Squire or a Mexican-made Fender guitar. If you haven't already, be sure to go back and watch the other videos. The first one was just an overview of what I did. The second one was on the Bixby installation. The third one was on the bridge modifications and the saddles. And today we're going to be talking about the tuners. So was there anything wrong with the original Glarry tuners? Not necessarily, but you have to consider that the entire guitar costs about $120. So you can imagine the cost savings that they try to employ in the materials for the tuners. I mean, basically they're made of cheap pot metal and they're the bottom of the line. And for me personally, if you've watched any of my videos, you probably know that I don't prefer the clunky look of modern tuners with the big washer on the front of the headstock. I much prefer the original style vintage tuners. I just like the way they function. I've never had any tuning issues with them, and they're super easy to restring. You just bend the string, you stick it down in the hole, put it to the slot, and you wind it up. You don't have to worry really about the length as much of the string and getting that perfect. So there is your overview. Let's get into the details. The first step, courtesy of Captain Obvious, is to take off the old tuners. Actually, before that, if it wasn't already obvious enough, you have to remove the strings. All this should be fairly straightforward and simple, so I won't spend too much time on it. I will note that I used a 10mm socket, and that was helpful in removing the screw and bushing portion of the tuners. And don't forget that with these Charler style tuners, there's one screw per tuner on the back holding them in place. Of course, if you choose vintage style tuners like I did, you're not going to be able to reuse those screw holes. In fact, you're going to have to fill these in and make some new ones, which we'll discuss later. Speaking of adaptation, modern tuners require 10mm holes in the headstock, but vintage ones use a smaller 8mm hole. Luckily, if you go from modern to vintage, they make adapter bushings, which are easy to pop in. If you're going the other way, however, from vintage to modern, that's a whole different ball game, and we won't be discussing that here. The adapter bushings or ferrules that I chose were from Kluson. The exact model number is MB65LN. Other types I've tried are more bulky and not quite as elegant. The actual tuners I chose were the Goto SD91 model. These are your standard Fender vintage 6-in-a-line tuner. They're great quality and affordable. They have a 1:15 gear ratio and an 05M button, which in Goto's catalog just means a nickel butterbean style button. I've installed these same tuners on another Strat and Tele that I have. I'll be sure to include links to those videos. To my surprise, the set I got not only came with the normal 8.8mm bushings, but it also came with 9.2mm bushings, which apparently Fender has also used at points in its history. Oddly enough, they are different depths, and I don't exactly know why that is. I'm sure there's a reason. Maybe because the original holes were tapered? I'm not sure. If you know the reason, feel free to leave a comment below. And finally, a tool was included to help remove or install the tuners, which I didn't end up using. Installing the adapter bushings was pretty easy in my case because they didn't fit very snugly, which really isn't a good thing. They should fit fairly tight. In some situations, you might even need to enlarge the holes in your headstock. If that's the case, I recommend a reaming tool. For me, when I flipped the neck over and tapped on the headstock, they just fell out, which meant I needed to bring in my old friend, painter's tape. I used the tape to wrap around the bushings to fill in the tiny gaps and make them more snug. This is specific to each hole. For example, one bushing might require one full wrap of tape, while another might take 1.5 wraps, or maybe just 3/4 of a wrap. My theory for this being acceptable to do is that tape is made out of paper, and paper is made out of wood, and well, headstocks are made out of wood. So it's the same thing as having a perfectly drilled hole, right? At least that's what I tell myself to make me feel better. Anyway, when it was all said and done, the bushings fit much nicer, as demonstrated by me trying the old knock on the back of the headstock test again. At At this point, I did a rough fit by dropping the tuners in and using a ruler as a straight line to get an idea of any fit up issues. And to my dismay, there was a pretty sizable gap between the G and B string tuners, as you can see here. Also, the low E string tuner was really close to the edge of the headstock, which will come back to haunt me later, as you'll see. One solution I thought of for the large space between the tuners was a screw with a larger sized head. However, the one I had on hand that was closest in size was still too big of a diameter. So I decided that I would try and cheat each tuner ever so slightly in order to shrink that gap between the G and B string tuners. The trick here is not to move the tuners too much. You don't want the shafts going crooked or having unnecessary stress put on them. The next step was to mark the holes. I used a fine tipped, sort of wet ink pen. I'm sure there's a better or more proper name, but basically you just want to make sure that the pen or marker actually leaves a visible mark. Hopefully that's obvious. And just to give me more reassurance, I used my straight edge with a pencil to mark a line through all the markings. At that point, I did another rough fit up just to be sure. From there, I took a drill by hand and made a good starter hole for each mark. This step isn't necessary, but I wanted to make sure that my drill didn't slip or anything. Once that was done, I took my drill bit and marked it with painter's tape for a depth stop. In other words, so I know how deep to drill or not to drill. It should be noted here that I used a 1/16 inch drill bit. In hindsight, as you'll see, I should have used a 5/64 inch bit. What I've learned now is that for softwoods like alder or basswood, a 1/16 inch bit is fine. But for hardwoods like maple, which is what this neck is, you need the 5/64 inch bit. At this point, I used an eraser to remove my pencil marks, and then I used some wiggity wax to lubricate the screws before tightening them down.
'Cause inside out is wiggity whack.
I was pleasantly surprised to find out that the spacing was going to work, even on that pesky spot between the G and B string tuners. However, to my chagrin, when I cranked down on the screw for the low E string tuner, I heard an odd popping sound and realized that I had put a slight crack in the headstock.
Holy
Fudge.
Only I didn't say fudge.
And that, my friends, is why you should use a 5/64 inch drill bit. So to combat this and fix my mistake, I decided I need some really thin glue to get down into the crack and seal it. So I decided to try Loctite Ultra Liquid Control Super Glue. The information available said that it worked on wood and was thin enough to get into tight spaces. So even though I didn't capture it on camera, basically I used a screw to open up the crack a bit and feed glue down into it. I let it sit for 24 hours to cure, and thankfully it held just fine. Needless to say, I went back to each tuner hole and widened them with a 5/64 inch drill bit. Alright, that's all I have for you today. Thanks for watching. As always, I've been Nathan, you've been watching this video, and I don't have a slogan. Aren't you glad?